Welcome to the second Public Culture lecture. And I would just like to let you know the Public Culture Committee is a recently formed committee whose purpose is to promote scholarly exchange between the Department of Educational Studies, the Faculty of Education, and the broader university community through academic events. This year, this includes the Public Culture Series, where we envision that this year's speakers will highlight the contribution of theory and methodology to scholarship. For these seminars, faculty members have invited colleagues from various institutions in Canada and abroad. Today, Andre has invited Susan to discuss her research and will introduce the seminar. But before I let you go, I would like to invite you again to come and attend the next Public Culture Series seminar on November the 20th, when Gert Wittstad will be speaking on theory and research in education, the case for pragmatism. Thank you.
Okay. I'll start by thanking you for coming and briefly say that we are all honored, and I'm honored to be able to present Susan Robertson to this department. Let me say a few words about Susan. I'm sure you've read the information that went out and the links that went with it. However, I think it is important for us, as we frame this presentation, to speak to the work of Susan in areas that are of great importance and great interest to many of us in this department. Susan is a professor of sociology of education at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Bristol in the UK. And she has been active academically in many, many countries, among which Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and England, including in parts of China and Hong Kong, if I understand well. She's very much involved in major academic endeavors in the field of globalization, societies, and education. She's the founding director of the Center for Globalisation, Education and Societies at the same university, Bristol, and also the founding co-editor with Roger Dale of the journal Globalisation, Societies and Education. I think many of us here have been exposed to the work published in that journal, and some of us may have been even submitting papers there. Susan's research is focused on the study of education in the broader social and political context, economic context as well. And she's trying to analyze the forces and the complexities associated with globalization and regionalization on education and educational policies. One of her contributions that I think is particularly important for this department is her contributions to critical spatial studies, through which she has analyzed the relationship or the intersections between policy and state transformations. Susan has several affiliations of importance, through which she brings her work to bear on the wider community and the discussions that go in these fields. As I said, she's the director of the Center for Globalisation, Education and Societies. She's also the thematic director of Learning Societies at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Bristol, and a pathway coordinator of Global Political Economy Southwest Doctoral Training Center. And also, as I said, a founding co-editor of Globalisation, Societies and Education. Many of her projects deal with universities and higher education more broadly. Some of her more recent projects deal with universities and city regional development, an aspect that I know personally, again, many of us are working about, questions of governance and educational transitions in Europe, and the intersection between universities and global and regional economies. The question of knowledge societies and knowledge economies also has received attention in her work, and some of her more recent publications have been discussing these issues straightforwardly. For instance, she just co-authored with F. Vostel a paper by the name of titled Knowledge Mediators and Lubricating Channels on the Temporal Politics of Remissioning the university. Other work touches also on university rankings, and I know that some of us are working on it, with OLDS, World University Rankings on the new arts of governing quality. So I think I would like also to signal important work that has been done and which I have used in those of us who have been in my course on higher education, governance, about globalization and regionalism in higher education. If you remember, that is also an area to which Susan has made significant contributions. So without further ado, I would like to present our speaker today, Susan Robertson, and she's going to talk to us, present us her work on conceptual and methodological challenges in studying education policies and practices in a globalizing world. Thank you, Susan, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre. Let me start by saying thank you to all of you for coming. Special thanks particularly to the Public Culture Committee. I think it is a wonderful occasion, and I applaud you for, partly because you bring me here, but actually also when I got the invitation from Rowena and Andre on behalf of the committee to ask me to think about the kind of conceptual and methodological challenges in an area that I'm currently working in. And the invitation then was to work it through a problematic in some way. And roughly this notion I'd have 10-15 minutes to think about the challenges and then to move myself to a case. I feel a bit like a dilettante actually when you were reading out, you know, I'm working on city regional development and rankings, and I actually am going to be talking about the global governance of teachers' labour, which I have a very long-standing interest as the case I want to look at. But I've chosen that case in particular because not only have I just published a piece recently, but it highlights, I think, very dramatically the kind of phenomena that I want to speak to today. And this kind of activity is taking place in those spaces that we typically don't look. We go about our everyday business, we tend to put the global up there, and I'm going to make us pull the global right down in here, in our places and our everyday places. So I'm going to insist that that has to be a way forward. And then I'm going to begin to ask some questions about in whose interests is it, and particularly for a profoundly national activity, teachers' work, but we could have put academic labour in there as well. That the kinds of phenomena that I want to kind of outline and interrogate today are the developments that we need to be looking at very closely. And I'm also going to argue, I think, that these developments are taking place in a space, in a global space, where the kinds of ways that we've asked for public accountability, and this is a public culture committee, this notion of public accountability, a notion of democracy, a notion that we can, as our citizens, make claims around the kinds of activity to do with teachers, their work, how they operate in schools and so on, is fundamental to the new kinds of politics that are emerging. So my questions are essentially, what are the conceptual and methodological challenges we face in doing critical education policy analysis work today? Now, it's not that there's not lots of education policy analysis work done. And in fact, if you go to Microsoft, if you go to Cisco Systems, they've got very large departments of education policy analysis activity. Okay? So we actually have new spaces in places engaged in thinking about education policy in ways in which I think we don't recognise, and in ways in which it directs education activity in a policy sense in ways that we don't recognise. So my question is, what makes it critical? And then why does it matter that we think about these things? So I'm going to start by kind of shaking up the terrain with what I'm going to call a set of isms, a way in which we tend to come to phenomena and tend to give it the same kind of meaning, or we get frustrated that we can't fix the meanings that we have historically, like a word like public or even indeed private, because actually these concepts are under reconstruction. They've been destabilized and they have been hollowed out and they're being filled with different kind of activity. I'm going to ask the question then, what might be a new set of signposts for the contemporary period, and then what methodological and conceptual challenges does something like a case looking at teacher policies present us with. Now, my starting point, and many of you who do policy work will recognise the seminal work of John Prunty. Okay? Policy is, he argued, the authoritative allocation of values. Okay? And almost every PhD or any text on policy rolls this one out. Okay? Prunty wrote in 1985. Okay? And this is not far off 30 years ago. Clearly he would have written this a good on 30 years ago. And yet we know the world has changed. We've had almost 2.5 decades of neoliberalism. The landscapes of education are dramatically different now. We see global actors. We've had an economic and financial crisis. So the question and the challenge to us is, what does education policy work look like now in the 21st century, and more precisely in 2012? And does the kind of challenges when Prunty puts out his signposts for critical policy analysis kind of still stack up? And I'm going to actually argue when he presents the challenges in the mid-1980s, he's looking back at a particular period that is marked by change, but the manifestations of the relationships of power, the kinds of actors that are on the stages, regional, global, local stages, and I want to say something about how to understand those concepts, are remarkably different. Now, this is what Prunty says in the mid-1980s about the decades before in terms of doing policy work. Now, it's interesting actually for us to think about the first journals on education policy emerge actually in the mid-1980s. Both Education Policy and the Journal of Education Policy Studies both emerge in the early to mid-1980s. And to some extent, it's a recognition of the need to think in much more critical and problematic ways around the shift from what was largely highly bureaucratically organised systems through regulation and so on. So there was a lot more to play for in terms of policy. Okay? So policy being somewhat different to administrative regulation. When we hit the 1980s and we see the attempt to set in place, set in train, some basis for the reorganisation of public sectors that included, and the economy, but included education as a public sector. He was very critical of the conceptualization of policy itself. He argued that there was a very narrow role attributed to policy, the work of policy analysts. He criticised the dominance of functionalist and systems-oriented theorising, the lack of attention to values and ethical issues, and the failure for policy analysis to ameliorate socio-educational problems. And of course he's reflecting at this point on the very significant amounts of money that had gone into education systems in the 1970s. The Coleman report was one of those that in fact begins to become very politically exercised by what appeared to be the failure of very significant state investments in the wake of the civil rights issues essentially in the United States, to actually resolve some fundamental problems of social inequalities, issues of poverty, and so on. He, of course, is also criticising the dominance of functional theory. Okay. This idea that there was a set of demands out there, they run through this kind of administrative black box. Those inside the black box have no particular interest in what the outcomes are. They're deliberating on the best possible outcome, and out it comes, and it solves some kind of policy problem. Now, we've come a long way since then. We've opened up the black box. We actually know that different government departments, for example, will be at times populated by different kinds of epistemic and class-oriented communities. And through that time, I think what we have also seen, and numerous studies have kind of charted those changes, education finding itself in a diminished role, and in a diminished sense of the power that it can wield in relation to other departments that in fact rise to preeminence. So the rise of treasury, economic departments, departments of trade, are all those spaces also within government that were not kind of that visible at the time that Prunty is actually thinking about these issues. But what's changed since those times? What has changed has been, I think, that the world has been very dramatically remade in a multiplicity of ways. More recently, an unfolding China project, declining standing of those that were preeminent in guiding the world, the United States in particular. What has also changed, I think, is we've seen a deepening of neoliberalism as an organising political project around the world, starting in Chile in the 1970s and 80s, of course, and then kind of pushed out right around the world in various guises. So that's given us 3 decades fundamentally of neoliberalism as it's dominated kind of political agendas and policy agendas and fundamentally destabilised the kinds of conceptual lenses that we've used, which have actually posed, I think, really important methodological challenges for doing critical education policy work. Because of course what we see emerging through this period of time is the rise of a discourse around globalisation, a rise in a discourse around building knowledge-based economies, an attempt from those parts of the world who felt very vulnerable into looking at ways in which they would begin to build regional blocks in relation to global phenomena, so that increasingly we found ourselves in a kind of kind of polar, or a kind of or a set of geostrategic projects at the level of Europe, down into, or NAFTA was the first one in this part of the world in 1994, and increasingly in the Southeast Asian and East Asian world, an attempt for that part of the world to come together and look at ways in which they might form forms of kind of trade and increasingly social and welfare solidarity in ways in which it counters the sense that we live in a global world and you can't control global forces. Essentially then, I think these kinds of developments have upset the kinds of conceptual and methodological tools that we've used. And I see those challenges, and I've written about this with my colleague Roger Dale, as forming 4 isms. Okay? Methodological statism, spatial fetishism, educationism, and methodological nationalism. Okay? So what do these isms actually mean? Essentially, an ism is an attempt to kind of take for granted in a continuing way the meanings that any concept had, okay? Like the state, okay? Because increasingly we see other state forms, or even indeed the word education. Okay. To some extent it's increasingly being eclipsed by another word called lifelong learning, and the question is, what's the politics around the eclipsing of a word called education with another project called lifelong learning? So the idea of ism is to suggest an approach to the objects that take them as unproblematic and assumes a constant and shared meaning. They have become fixed, abstract and absolute. And part of our job as theorists is to always understand that what we need to always do is to put our conceptual tools on notice, because in fact we see the world differently as those tools that we adopt come into contact with the everyday and real phenomena out there. Concepts that I've been working with around the notion of the public, the idea of the private, the idea of the state and so on, it's incredibly difficult to hold a notion of the public as we had in the post-war era. That notion of the public simply is very, very difficult to hold. Once it was a very clear public and private. We understood what the public was. It was the state, it was state funding, provision, ownership, forms of regulation and so on. But increasingly, as that governing model has been replaced by what some writers talk about as governance, which essentially is signalling the emergence of a range of other actors coming in and getting involved in the activity called education, that the word public, because are we talking about vouchers which are public money into private hands? That's sort of public activity. Is it public? Is it private? Where's the line? And what does that mean if we can and need to draw that line around interests, motivations, and actors, and so on? So the first one, methodological nationalism, is an assumption fundamentally that did hold more or less until the 1980s, when globalisation makes its entry. Gets named in the mid-1980s, about the same time that education policy becomes a very formal area of study. And we kind of need to remind ourselves that education policy is a newer area of study. We often think that these are things that go back a long, long way, but they don't necessarily. They arise at a particular time to try and understand particular phenomena in the world. So methodological nationalism asks and tries to interrogate the question about the kind of totality of activity that gets societal activity, that gets contained within a container called the national. And essentially this is where that container called the national would actually use the treaty or the Peace of Westphalia, which gets struck in 1648, to actually say that nations are themselves the sovereign spaces, and that other nations cannot move into those spaces. So the notion of sovereignty and authority to determine your own state of affairs is the kind of world order that we had until the 1980s. And then as we see the emergence of what we call kind of global forces, the thinning and particularly the globalisation of neoliberalism, okay, so that's a localism, largely starts in the US and in parts of Europe, if we put ordoliberalism in here. And it finds itself as a localism moved into other parts of the world. So you can see what I'm doing conceptually here is I'm not allowing the global to kind of sit up there. It's a political project, an ideological project that has its genesis in particular places, locations, and in fact moves into other parts of the world and circulates more broadly beyond those other parts of the world. So from Chile and the United States, the United Kingdom, into countries like Australia, New Zealand, a prominent laboratory. Different countries, of course, mediate the impact of neoliberalism, in part because of their own political and historical and social traditions, in part because of their formal governmental structures that might minimise and manage the full impact of these political projects. But nevertheless, 30 years on, what we can actually see is a fairly embedded neoliberal project despite the 2008 crisis. And in fact, elsewhere I've actually written and borrowed a very nice phrase from Colin Crouch, who talks about the strange non-death of neoliberalism. Okay. The World Bank, for example, has simply escalated its ambitions to roll out, and we'll see this when it comes to teachers' work, a very ambitious neoliberal imaginary around how it wants to drive forward an escalated privatisation agenda. And you kind of think, haven't they learned? Where have they been? But also this includes the benchmarking and control of teachers' labour as well. And we'll take a look at what that actually means. So increasingly, it is very difficult to make the case that the world is actually made up of sovereign states only in governmental arenas. And one telling example is when the World Trade Organization that got launched in 1995, the negotiations that took place in the so-called famous Green Room, you had in those spaces actors like Apollo Global. Now you'd have to say, what were they doing there? Okay. Most of our perhaps global activity, let's take the OECD, it was an intergovernmental organisation, largely of the Rich Countries Club, and it would have been difficult to have actually argued that there would be a place around the table for private actors. Okay. But increasingly we have seen these private actors, philanthropic actors, and we'll see them again with teachers' work, very involved in shaping policy in locations, in local spaces, but also in other locations, and less so now with the World Trade Organization that seems to have lost a lot of its steam. But if we look at the European education space, we'll see the round table of industrialists and so on, who are very significantly involved in policy. And in some cases, this will include countries that are not yet involved in the European project. So we need to look at a range of scales on which these actors operate and which they mobilise the right to rule. So what scale does, the notion of the global, is it's an attempt to use the idea of the kind of vertical or hierarchical power to advance a project of rule. Okay, so vertical power actually gives you some claim or an attempt to claim a project of rule. And we see this here in Canada, where you'll see multi-scalar governing activity, local authorities, we've got district authorities, we've got provincial authority, and we've actually got national authority. So we can already see on our landscapes before these supranational spaces or governing projects begin to emerge. Already we had seen multi-scalar governing projects emerge. Now, it was not the case, actually. Many of the theorists argued that then what happened is we just saw very significant, decentralisation within the national territorial space. But in places like Canada, where you had very significant local governing, it moved in the opposite direction. I was in Alberta at the time, and what was really interesting is local school boards lost their power and it moved up to the provincial. So things moved in different directions. And in some cases, what we saw is some of the authority and sovereignty moved beyond the national state space, and it was acquired and taken up by different actors. And in the European space, we see a growth in the European Commission project, the emergence of a European education space, a European higher education space, which now has every university within the European space and beyond the European space actually have a common architecture. Okay? And that now overrides largely, because institutions and national governments have largely signed on, that overrides national policy and national practice. So a multi-scalar world that now decenters the nation as the nodal power in determining politics and policy. Secondly, methodological statism, a particular form of the state based on the Westphalian state. And if you're involved in trying to study Europe, or indeed one of my students is studying the Gulf Cooperation Council, or if we move into other spaces down into the Latin American region, we'll see the Alliance for the Bolivarian states, essentially, or new kinds of regional agreements. What's going on here is kind of the emergence of kind of a crypto state form, okay? So they are given forms of sovereignty. And what we can start to see if we look at the European case is there's a kind of crypto state. It's not a Westphalian state anymore, but something that represents something that looks like some kind of state power that in fact regulates, it has the legal infrastructures. You can take cases to the European Court of Justice. In education they have done that, and done that in a small way but successfully. And as we're coming up to student fees in higher education, there's a notion that in UK students might well take cases to the European Court of Justice. So there's a kind of, we often define a state as having some kind of enforcement capability, as having an army, which is Weber's famous conception of what makes a state. And in fact, we do see arm-banded forces that represent the EU that actually did operate in the European space, and particularly around Bosnia and Herzegovina. So a challenge to some extent to Weber and this kind of continuing commitment to a particular notion of the state. We were just talking earlier about China, and it's incredibly difficult to take your toolkit of the capitalist state Westphalian style into talking with students in China. Okay, all the textbooks and all the articles that you'd give our students here don't make any sense. And indeed, you'd actually find that some writers would actually argue that that China is actually a tributary state, that in fact the form of that state is very, very different, and we need, it seems to me, if we're working with policy students in those spaces, that we actually need to develop a different kind of toolkit to understand those kinds of spaces. The third one is what I call spatial fetishism. And it's that great temptation, and I'm a journal editor, and so I tend to go to conference presentations and it's got the word global in. Okay. So I go to the presentation and I'm often very disappointed because it's kind of just business as usual. Okay. And any of you who've studied the global, it's kind of the latest backdrop. And I think largely it kind of replaced postmodernism, you know, so now it's the global something or other. But the really important question is, what's the difference that actually the global or space makes here? How are social relations being reconstituted? And if space is actually a way of thinking about social relations, all of our social relations are in space, then what does it mean to think about the global in this kind of environment, as opposed to thinking about the local or the national and so on? In other words, what does space do, and how is space being organised and regulated differently? And here I would actually argue that the global gets built as a platform from which you can launch political projects. You can actually claim an imaginary called the global, and political work actually gets done. The same at the level of the regional. Methodological educationism is something that both Roger Dale and myself have begun to kind of use as a way of asking us to kind of unsettle categories like education. Okay. Education sectors look very different. If you were to look at the education sector now in the UK, and specifically England, you would actually see such a dramatically different landscape. I was having a conversation I think with Wendy yesterday about school inspectors. Okay? They're not employed by the state, they're outsourced. Okay? Ofsted manages this whole process, but so that education system is hugely dominated by huge amounts of outsourcing, very large numbers of actors. For example, KPMG, which is a big global consulting firm, They run a school in London, okay, teaching KPMG style entrepreneurship as part of their curriculum. Now you'd have to say that's not what we meant by an education system. We meant something different in our thinking. So clearly what I'm actually running my way toward is to argue that in fact that world that we had looked at, largely through the kinds of tools that Prunty kind of, even critical policy, nationally organised or subnationally organised, where we looked at policy as contested, where we looked at the authoritative allocation of values. The question I have is, where is authority now? And increasingly, it's privatised forms of authority. Increasingly, Gerald would know this is, and writers like, she's a very good, what is it? I'll remember it in a sec. Writing on the rise of the legal profession, Claire Cutler, in fact, who is actually, I think, based in Victoria, writing on the rise of legal departments and law and the role that significantly they play in organising education activity, particularly on the policy and particularly on the governance front. And this has actually then led writers like Saskia Sassen, she's a fantastic writer, and her profoundly important book, Territory Authority Rights, she's actually argued that we can no longer think of the social contract as national. We can no longer think of education as part of the social contract as a national or a subnational contract. But the question that then gets presented to us is, how do we think about education policy in a multi-scalar world, and where the redistribution of education activity is then across a series of scales? If we said policy could be contested, how do we contest through the WTO? Okay, though I would argue it's less important now. But increasingly, those actors have come straight down to our Privy Councils and made claims straight to the Privy Council. Do education, or those actors who are interested in these outcomes, know that these things are taking place? And where would they contest those kinds of outcomes if they were actually aware of these processes? So let me now move toward what I'm going to argue would be a set of signposts for a multi-scalar education policy analysis. Now, I've written about this and spoken about this in a public lecture that one of your colleagues, Shel Rubenstein, was at earlier this year. So it's out on the web, so I'm just going to kind of work my way through this fairly quickly. But it kind of follows from some of the comments that I've made, and then I'll turn to the case that I want to look at. So the first signpost, I think, is we urgently need to rescue this idea of the global. And it's no straightforward concept either. Okay? And we do use it in a multiplicity of ways. One is, we are often describing the global as a condition of the world. We live in a global knowledge economy, or we live in a global world village, if we want a benign version of that. So this is a way of actually describing a world as different, okay, a condition of the world. And it's the kind of writing that James Mittelman, who's the political theorist, is actually writing about in what he describes as critical globalisation studies. It's also a discourse. Okay? Politicians are very good at using the idea of the global to sidestep, remove themselves from their responsibility in terms of decision making. Okay? So it's a discourse that, in fact, where there's no alternative. The global, it's a global world, and we see many policy documents, particularly politicians in their forewords to these policy documents, invoking the global in that way. It's a project as well. Okay, and it's not only a project that's tied to neoliberalism, although that's clearly the most famous, I think, project that we know of. But we can actually see the globalisation of human rights. We can see the globalisation of the open source movement. We can see the globalisation of indigenous rights, and so on. So seeing it as these projects, and then moving to this next one as both scale and reach. When we talk about reach, it's actually where a localism, to use Boaventura de Sousa Santos's concept, it's where a localism which is very local, is given some kind of spatial extension, and then it then kind of claims as the hegemonic moment. And makes any local entity, you know, a kind of absent rival. Okay, it's to crowd out the other possibilities in the local. So some localism, so everything starts in a place. It doesn't start up there. Everything starts in a place. And part of a genealogy, and we'll start to see this with teachers' work, is to actually recognise the places and the actors and the form and the mechanisms for generating forms of spatial extension, and then look at how that happens and what the consequences of that actually are. The global clearly is invoked in a hierarchical sense as a scale in relation to the regional and the national, and in invoking some kind of hierarchy also invokes some kind of right and sovereignty and authority to rule, and that's very clearly what's happened in these regional blocks and global institutions and so on. And finally, the notion of global as habitus. Okay, and Vanessa down here at the end of the table has written a lot on global citizenship in a critical way, but there is this notion, and many universities are exercised by how they can develop as part of their offer this idea of the globally competent student as part of their mission in the 21st century. So it's then to kind of, in thinking about the global, is to not allow it to sit up there, but to insist that the global is in here. And to make the point that Sasson makes very profoundly, it's the ways in which these projects enter into our local spaces and into our institutions and our places of work and our classrooms and into our everyday settings, formal and non-formal, and remake those spaces in ways in which they do work for these other projects out there. So what she's actually arguing is a way in which we're beginning to kind of connect developments in these subnational settings to agendas and so on that are developing out there. The second signpost, and I've kind of alerted you to this, is to actually begin to populate our education spaces with a range of different actors, and some of them, for example, like Straighterline. It's a small firm in the United States, pays its PhD, pays its employees with a PhD $5 an hour to supervise students enrolled in undergraduate programs who actually use this new kind of payment calculation for how you would pay for your degree on a monthly basis. Okay, so you encounter all kinds of odd people, and the best place to see these is to go to an education industry fair. So if you go to NAFSA or the Observatory for Borderless Higher Education, you'll see many of these kinds of players, local and more global entrepreneurs promoting education agendas. What Standards & Poor's doing there? They actually run, as part of their activity, they run reports for schools and universities where they rank them. They give them a rating. And your interest rates are dependent on whether you get a single or a double or a AAA rating. Okay, I don't know if UBC is rated by Standards & Poor's or one of the other rating agencies, but they're hugely significant in terms of the amounts of money that schools, charter schools in the United States and universities, but this is globally, can borrow. So all kinds of unusual players are in there in ways in which it destabilizes the idea of an education actor. Okay? I put Microsoft in there, the ISC, which is an organisation I've been looking at very closely, part of the World Bank, lends to private local entrepreneurs around the world and so on. So again, part of this job is beginning to just do a mapping process for ourselves in ways in which we understand the full import, the full significance of those actors who are there. Signpost 3. What might be the kinds of accounts out there that we might look at to help us with understanding these kinds of developments? And I'll skip over these quite quickly, but to say actually that there are a number of accounts out there that look rather like sociological institutionalism, which is John Mayer's work, Stanford, where they're looking at the ways in which we get the diffusing out, and it's his language, of concepts like lifelong learning, right to education, education for all, schooling and so on. But we don't see actors in here. We don't see those who are promoting education for all, for example, in low-income countries like Africa, with their own kinds of agendas. Missing in this kind of an account is these kind of actors up here, the IFC, who actually funds money to these entrepreneurs into places like India and Pakistan, and with their own particular agendas there. So sociological institutionalism, very, very big in areas like comparative education, but very low on critical capacity and a very thin conception of power. If things just diffuse, then we're back to the juggernaut thesis of globalisation. No actors, no interests, no motivations, and so on. The globally structured agenda, which is my colleague Roger Dale, who actually argues that what we need to do is to kind of see it as a kind of a bigger project to do with capitalism and so on. But, and I've had arguments with Roger about this, it's to kind of, I think, place it all back up there again and to do with capitalism. And I think what we must also see is that we can't reduce social life to capitalism entirely. Different modernities are at work, for example. And what we also see would be kind of variations in capitalism and so on. And I would want to offer an account of the world as kind of vertically and horizontally kind of petitioned and organised. Policy network analysis, Skeeter Steiner-Kamsey, interesting, important, and lots of writers doing policy work like Stephen Ball are using this. But the problem is here that what goes missing are the new forms of hierarchy that are being built. Okay? When you actually go into spaces, and I've been a policy advisor to the European Commission, and you go to a ministerial meeting that's organised by the European Commission, you're completely stunned that some of the working groups are chaired by the OECD. You're saying, what are they doing in here? Okay. And they try very hard, and I've been in those spaces, to push a particular kind of an agenda. New actors with hierarchical power, for example, the Commission clearly see the expertise in many ways of the Commission as crucially important for building its own capacity. The vertical case, which is Vavris and Bartlett have been promoting, kind of trying to then say, okay, we have a multi-scalar world, so can we just kind of take a slice of this, like a geological kind of slice, and kind of look at the substratum. But the problem here, I would argue, is what they do is they continue to keep the global up there as kind of capitalism that's kind of floating around, big macro structural accounts. And what we know is that capitalism is fixed. Okay? We can go to Seattle and see Microsoft, for example. We can go to Washington and see the World Bank. These are in places. They have extension, but that's a different kind of issue. So that takes you back to what I was arguing to do with globalisation. Noah Sobe's work on scopic systems, taking the work from Norsetina, looking at financial systems. In this way, much more interested in looking at how you get kind of global projection how do rankings somehow travel through space and become, as policy instruments, ways of actually making the German federal government and the Länder do dramatically different things in Germany because of the PISA shock. Okay? It's in part because there are new technologies at work, and Norsetina calls these scopic systems. So these are potentially interesting, but again, what we would need to understand would be why these particular technologies of policy and projection, and how do they work as some kind of authoritative mechanism that changes behaviour in particular ways. And finally, someone like Steve Carney's work that has encountered a lot of interest in certain circles. But for Steve, everything's in flux. Everything is a set of flows. And I would actually want to argue that, in fact, what we can see is new points of fixity. Okay? So everything's just not floating around. It feels like that because we don't understand the significance and the enormity and the rapidity of these changes. But what we can identify are new points of fixity. Social life happens in institutions, gets reproduced in institutions, and social relations get made in that way. And so what we need to do is we need to look at the new points of fixity and look at who's being fixed in these points, what claims to power and rule these actors are engaged with, and how does it matter. If we look at signpost 4 then, and I've made this point, what we can then see, I think, is very significant transformations in the national state in ways in which I think this notion of power and authority and political sovereignty simply haven't captured. And finally, how do we research these kinds of spaces? How do we get in and look at the Commission? One of my students has done that with great grief, and in fact he had to submit a PhD, get it examined, and we've had to put the box on that, and we had to kind of do a in the public consumption interest version of the PhD. How do you get in and look at Microsoft? Zara Banji did that. I examined it and then wrote in my notes, why isn't she asking these questions? Okay? A legal letter came the afternoon she'd been there to interview to say that in fact you will never be reporting on these kinds of things. So she doesn't talk about capitalism. She doesn't talk about a services-based economy. She doesn't talk about a new knowledge-based economy, and so on. And she has written about this since. So the case now I just quickly, in about 10 minutes, want to kind of look at with you is to kind of then say, okay, what does this look like? You know, Susan, you're making these claims. Can you fix your claims? Can you defend your claims? And I'm going to do it through a case that I've been working on over the last 12 to 18 months around teachers' work. So teachers, we know, are profoundly local. They're people like you and me in this room. Okay? We're not floating up there. We're employed by public and private institutions. In some cases we're employed by for-profit actors, not-for-profit actors. So that landscape has actually been changing. So what I do in this paper is I make the first move in an argument. Okay? If we're to understand what's changed, then we need to kind of look back at what was. Okay? So the first move is actually to historicise what it is that we're actually looking at. And the first thing you begin to see is that, in fact, there have been, historically, global actors profoundly interested in teachers and the organisation of teachers' work. But for those of you who've ever looked at any of the UN organisations, unlike, for example, some of the more recent, perhaps global mechanisms, certainly the UN institutions, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and UNESCO, in the post-war period, in 1962, they develop and we'll see this, what ends up as a kind of a recommendation essentially, and to say that teachers need to be treated like professionals, and this is to be the basis of a debate between teachers in their national and subnational settings and their unions. Okay? And the ILO UNESCO recommendation, and it's only 2008 because it's been updated, which gets struck in 1962, says this about teachers. And you can see how far this is now from how we think about teachers and their work. Teachers should be regarded as a profession. It's a form of public service. Okay? Now, we know it's perhaps private now, which requires of teachers expert knowledge and specialised skills acquired and maintained through rigorous and continuing study. Teachers should enjoy academic freedom in the discharge of professional duties to include choice and selection of teaching materials, and that their salaries should reflect the importance to society of the teaching function. Okay? If you look around the world, you'll find that in fact we're a long way from this as some kind of imagined set of conditions for teachers and their work. In many cases, they don't select their texts. These are given to them. If you were to look at the United States and No Child Left Behind and the high stakes testing and so on, increasingly firms like Pearson and others are the producers of these texts, and they're also the producers of these tests. So the text and texts are actually hugely very large money-making enterprises. What Basil Bernstein, and here I've gone to using some of the work of Basil Bernstein, who of course has been very interested in the pedagogical identity. How do we become who we become? Okay? Because to some extent the object of policy and power is to make selves differently with different kinds of social relations. And so for Bernstein, a pedagogic identity is the manifestation within the self and the self's consciousness of those relays of power in the ways in which Bourdieu, for example, tried to talk about, we acquired a habitus or our cultural and our social capital. For Bernstein, it's kind of almost the kind of remaking of your DNA in that kind of sense. These guidelines then were to be a dialogue and so on, but the way I've tried to represent this is to try and then take Bernstein's work about what he calls the field of symbolic control. Okay? So in the kind of ways I was representing to you the field of symbolic control, in the post-war period right up until the 1980s, the field of symbolic control was dominated by national and subnational actors. An attempt by actors like the ILO and UNESCO to kind of have some presence, but actually they don't have much traction, because in fact, in a regulatory sense, this is a recommendation. Okay? So they're not powerful mechanisms that code into the conversations in a national and subnational setting. Teachers, their conditions of work, notions of professionalism, and so on. I'm sorry it's a little bit washed out. And I would actually represent it as this. In terms of the top line there, what we see is fairly strong global classification, okay, a very strong announcement about the good teacher, the professional teacher. It's very clear. There are not multiple discourses here. But actually, as they went into national settings around the world, you would actually find very different conversations taking place around the good teacher. The United States would be very different to the UK, and I wrote about this in my book called Teachers' Work. And it was different in Canada, and it was different in Singapore, and so on. So we saw quite a lot of global diversity. So the mechanisms of recontextualization, okay, how we did things around here, tended to trump or dominate or overdetermine the global message. However, from 2000 onwards, what we see is a number of actors begin to close in on teachers. They're worried about global competition for nation states. They begin to look at things like PISA, and we can recognise the OECD's indicator and bench and statistics division under the helmship of Andreas Schleicher, who in fact within the OECD becomes a very powerful actor. They begin to kind of worry about teachers having too much discretion over the kind of knowledge that they chose to teach with, and potentially the outcomes for pupils and their learning. And so there's an attempt to kind of move in much closer, but they get joined by several other actors that we'll take a look at. McKinsey, for example, and increasingly to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So let's kind of take a look at quickly the kind of things that the OECD from 2000 onwards. It develops a whole range of outputs to do with a toolkit modernising the profession, arguing that teachers matter, arguing that, for example, that teachers need to think about being knowledge-driven, they need to think about a professional, evidence-based, knowledge-based to the kind of teaching methods and so on. And they set about developing a tool that has already collected one round of data called TALIS, which is the teaching assessment, teaching and learning international survey assessment tool, which is now going into its second round of data collection. In the first round, those who signed up to TALIS, which is this collection of data on teachers, said, we won't let you collect data from the same schools and link it to the same schools as the PISA data, okay, which you could see could be a potentially interesting and very powerful move on the part of the OECD. What did teachers do and what did learners do? But now in the second round coming up, they're actually able to do that. The countries have actually acquiesced. So we've got 24 countries. We've got more countries now signed up to the second round. TALIS 2013 will actually report in 2014, with the extra barb now that the PISA schools will actually now be included in this. So you see a very strong move on the part of the OECD, both to collect data on teachers, how they're teaching, and then now link this to pupil learning. Okay, so this is a long distance from that conversation of the professional teacher with their unions and their government about their knowledge. The second example here is the World Bank Group, and with the World Bank they have become very exercised by what they say is the industrial relations situation for teachers. So they have zeroed in on the organisation of teachers' work, and particularly what they would say would be the fact that there's a flat hierarchy, there's a flat structure, and that teachers are not driven by incentives. It's this kind of picture on a book called Making Schools Work, where you see a teacher here asleep, and the pupils, and they've actually used this in a very inflammatory way to begin this work of unravelling what they call Saber, and I'll just move over this point. So they have launched in 2011 Saber Teachers to collect data on teachers, other areas too, but I'm particularly focused on teachers. And if you start to look at the kind of data that they're collecting, they're looking at whether teacher absenteeism is reported, whether, for example, teachers have the right to what labour rights they have, and you can clearly see what they're going after, that they're actually looking for a collapsing or a challenge to teacher unionism, where the profession itself determines its conditions of work, and so on. So we have these two actors who are now joined by McKinsey, a global consulting firm that many of you might know has been very, very interested in the best performing schools. Their solution is teacher professional development, but of course they're in the wings to do all the teacher professional development, so they're very interested in that. I might just add Michael Barber, who was with the McKinsey lot, has now recently joined Pearson Education and is driving forward their initiative. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they have sunk what adds up to $1/3 billion US into looking at value-added measures. They've got 2,000 teachers across 6 states, and what they expect to do is to take the outcomes of this teacher effectiveness initiative and use Obama money to actually roll that out across the United States. Now, value-added measures, that is, that I can tell Andre exactly what value he added to my learning in distinction from, let's say, Wendy. Okay, this is hugely disputed. There are major writers like Stephen Gorard actually arguing that this is incredibly problematic. Let me just roll in the last one and then move to some conclusions. Pearson Education has partnered with the OECD. It was to run the 2015 OECD PISA survey. The OECD, I think, is running scared at the moment, and it's just withdrawn the contract from Pearson. But they're a player to watch, and they're a very significant and global player. They sit around the table with governments and are shaping policy even at the OECD kind of level. And it's this division within the OECD, and particularly Andreas Schleicher, and here I'm actually representing a big meeting in 2010 and 2011, the first and the second International Teachers Conference, where teachers definitely were not present. But you can see what's also going on that left-hand column here, where the positioning of the United States and why they need to collect data on teachers and how it's linked to PISA and so on. So we see the centre of power and authority move away from national territorial states into the OECD. And we can begin, I think, to represent this here by seeing other actors now. So recall that I presented you this kind of visual representation of the global actors in a more diminished role in relation to national states. Here what we see is a different kind of economy of players on what I would call the field of symbolic control, who are now driving out their view, their vision of the effective teacher. The OECD's vision of the effective teacher is that a teacher doesn't have disciplinary knowledge. And you ask yourself, what's that about? How do you teach science without scientific concepts? They favour constructivism. Okay? And the argument I would put here is that, in fact, it doesn't give you the resources, the genuine, powerful knowledge, as Michael Young argues, to actually understand our worlds beyond our local spaces. Okay? Disciplinary knowledges, or in the words of Marx, how do we understand the structuring of our wider worlds simply from the local experiences? You can, but they can be accidental. So in conclusion, I would want to try and represent this kind of an account, which in Prunty's terms, okay, if he was working with Basil Bernstein's recontextualizing fields, where we see the state and we see teachers in the middle and on the right-hand side, but increasingly we see in the middle column the state, some state authority going right up into the OECD space. Okay, governments have said you can collect PISA data. So what does this mean about state space, transformations of state space? How do we think about and make accountable commercial actors who claim commercial sensitivity for their tools, their tests, their legal status? Okay, they don't sit into a public space, and nor do we have the way to understand what kind of private actor they actually are. And I'm so thrilled to know that there are people who are working on this with the kinds of questions I think you need to ask, that in fact are not those who are legally working out public-private partnerships, but legally asking questions about these things. So, in conclusion, the notes toward critical global education policy analysis. I think they look something like this. Which new actors are at what scales and temporal horizons, through what logics of policy intervention and potential outcomes are they involved in reshaping education? Okay. What is Pearson doing? Going to Africa, funding 60 schools in Africa and Ghana, to be specifically, to be particular, and where the shareholders get some return from these children in these classrooms who on a daily basis, as they clock into their classrooms, the armband that's loaded up with some money and with 15 days grace is the way that they attend school every day. That's a real example. How do we contest that? How do we understand it? Why don't we know about it? It's partly because Pearson doesn't particularly want us to know about it. And if you want to see a very agitated Michael Barber being asked by an interviewer how to account for this, he kind of shuffles around on his chair and so on. Now that's a dramatic example, but in fact it's not too far distant from what's going on in the UK, and specifically England. How do we contest the emerging forms of private authority that operate in the education domain? And particularly where actors, for example, in my jurisdiction in England, the commercial firms have just said this is commercially sensitive. So when we get these different logics at work, okay, where does public accountability go? How can we, for example, if we're going to strike public-private partnerships, make sure that the private sector takes its fair share of the risk and also is actually publicly accountable, simply just doesn't go either missing or invokes commercial sensitivity, or another jurisdiction, okay, that in fact they're in the Middle East region and so on. What we need, I think, conceptually is to bring scale and hierarchy together, focus on policy movements over time and across space, so tracing Pearson and what they're looking, where they operate and so on. Look at the global within and not just above, and have a much more nuanced understanding of the global. And I think most importantly for me is the development of a new set of literacies. It's not just when we're talking about critical policy literacy. Those literacies, I think, have to have juridical literacy in them. They have to have financial literacy, and we need to expand the kinds of people, and I'm talking to things I know that are underway in your reorganisation, people who have expertise, different kinds of expertise, who can ask these questions. And finally, what then does it mean for policy as contested, or the authoritative allocation of values, and how do we contest these kinds of developments? I'm sorry it sounds negative. I don't ever feel negative. And I would just finish by saying that some of my own kind of more activist work has, with a number of foundations, in places like Africa and in the spaces like India and so on, put some of these questions onto the front page, and I think that's the work that we also need to try and do. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susan, for a very engaging and profoundly important presentation. We have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, so perhaps we can be efficient in these, so to speak. So the floor is yours now. Wendy?
I haven't had time to really carefully formulate my question, but I guess it relates in part to our conversation yesterday around the use of the terms private and public. Conceptualizing the educational field in those terms versus another term that you raised, and that's the societal. You were arguing in our conversation yesterday that we need to move away from that dualism, the private and the public. And yet I see you here using the term private and public quite a bit.
Yeah.
In particular, looking at your second question up there, how do we contest the emerging forms of private authority? I guess how do I make sense of that?
Yeah.
What are you arguing here? And you know, some of these organizations that you're talking about that are transnational, you know, are they public? Are they private? You know, in many cases, it's not really clear.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to pin me to the wall on that one. I mean, what is clear is words like public and private are very difficult concepts now to make stick. Okay, in the sense that if you looked at, let's say, a school in the UK, it might be owned by a private actor, leased back by the government. The student itself might find that, in fact, fairly significant private but household money in terms of fees goes with that child into the classroom and so on. So you're right to pull me up on that. In terms of private authority, I've put that there because in fact there's quite a significant literature by people like Claire Cutler and others who are talking about the rise of private authority. Okay, or Anne-Marie Slaughter would be another person that's also talking about this. Janine Weddell would be another. But you're right. I mean, I think the way that we need to kind of put these kinds of things is what activity is going on and what are the kind of the claims to lack of accountability, okay, in a public space around something that I would argue is a societal good, particularly education. It's profoundly a societal good. It matters that we educate our young people. It matters what they know. Okay, and it matters who they know as part of their education in terms of building social cohesion. So I think you're right. I mean, what I'm grappling for is, and have through some of the work that I've been doing, trying to work my way toward kind of phrases, for example, that are more accurate in the things that they're actually trying to describe. And I'm really only at the beginning of that kind of job. And I think that language will differ from place to place to place. So something like one of my colleagues at a meeting, in fact last week in Johannesburg, said, how do we make, he said, the policy question is this. It's not a question of whether a public school is better than a private school, which is where much of the research is focused. And charter schools, you can see that as an example. Who adds what to what, and you know, how many charter schools and in what proportion, and etc. His question was, is how do we make private actors act in the public good? Okay, and so there'd be a whole lot of things you'd need, or the societal good, he'd probably say. We'd need to unpack a whole lot of things around that. But I think it's being able to describe things better, okay, rather than, so we're filling up to some extent those concepts that have been hollowed out with a language of description about activity that in fact is closer to the mark empirically.
Thank you very much. Shayna?
Thank you for this very interesting talk. And at the very end, you mentioned the role of foundations. And I'd actually like to be able to have you elaborate on that a little bit. I do a lot of work with the Roma population in Central Eastern Europe, but also, of course, in Western Europe. And as I'm sure you're familiar, the Decade of Roma Inclusion, which brought about the Soros Foundation with the World Bank, specifically looking at the Roma Education Program, or Roma Education Fund, pardon me. And I'm just wondering where, in your discussion about these private actors, I mean, we can all like bemoan capitalist evil entities, you know, and anyone of us who's had a computer break hates Bill Gates. But foundations are often seen as like kind of good and aspiring and somehow a necessary evil, if not philanthropic. But there's a big problem there too, and I'm wondering where you're going in that kind of research, and particularly when addressing students who may not fit in the traditional notion of the nation state from the get-go, be they because they're immigrant refugee children, or because of our own march hands and other international groups.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think both those observations, questions are really important. I mean, not every foundation is the same as each other, okay? And I think that would be, so what we need is a careful empirical work. And so what we'd want to understand is what's the nature of those interventions. When I've been talking to, in the Asia Pacific region, ASBE, which are trying to understand public-private partnerships, many of the so-called partners in these partnerships are NGOs, okay, or foundations, for example, like, you know, Save the Children, and they say, well, we're private actors, okay, so are you talking about us? No, we're not. I think I'm particularly talking about, well, in the case of the Gates Foundation, where there's such a significant amount of money, some writers writing on the philanthropic organisations would actually argue that there's undue, okay, in a democratic sense, undue policy influence that they can have by virtue of the fact they can put that amount of money on the table. Okay, you know, so it's Soros in the case of Albania actually funds completely the Albanian education system. Okay, so in this sense, and some writing is now coming forward looking at the way in which particularly there used to be quite a lot of money going in, but in fact increasingly some of the foundations are, and you'll have Gap Clothing has its own foundations, there's a proliferation of foundations. One argument is, why aren't those foundations just putting it into kind of publicly provided education, and you let the demos actually make the decisions about how it's being spent and so on. So there's an argument that what is being preferred are specific and selective interventions where you can actually say to your shareholders, well, we did this and so on. And it's not helpful for public education more generally. And it is certainly not helpful for public debate about what kind of education system do we want. The failed states or the difficult populations like Roma, failed states being, or difficult states being Albania, I think are other issues that kind of that would warrant a separate discussion.
Thank you. Mona?
Thanks, Mona Gleason. I'm a historian in the department. Thank you very much. And I couldn't help, I was as you were talking, so many moments of recognizing of you've helpfully sort of put into categories what I sort of see unfolding everywhere. And I was thinking about trying to make sense of what's sort of happening in Canada. Particularly, it seems that there's like two different things going on at once that speak to your presentation, but what's really odd is that they're happening simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So this idea of, you know, our government dismantling public systems that are up for the public good, systems of welfare, systems of schooling, quite a rigorous attack on those systems in order to maximize profit, so to farm them out. But at the same time, there seems to be this odd ideological work around, you know, like increased attention to, you know, citizenship education. Yeah. And you know, the Canadian Museum of Civilization being recalled the Canadian Museum of History or something. And so this notion of sending these calls out across the country, how can we be more nationalistic? How can we have one story about our country? So these two processes seem to be going on at the same time. And I'm just wondering how you know, what you see in those kind of processes in terms of your argument.
I think you describe processes that we see in a number of different places. So there's a ramping up of nationalist kind of discourses. Yeah. So if schools, for example, or indeed, you know, universities are in competition with each other, they surely kind of reduce to some extent the kind of the quotient of, we know that, of social cohesion. However, it's hugely important for the functioning of any society, okay? And so the attempt to kind of build it up through a kind of rampant nationalism, which would be the alternate trajectory. I mean, schools were the places where there was very significant, you know, work going up in the national interest and so on, you know, common curriculum, etc. But as you get diversity across the system and notions of competition and so on, clearly you've got to do that kind of nation building work in other kinds of ways. I think what is also going on though in places both like Canada and you know, even Scandinavian countries, is they have seen that other element of globalisation, very significant inflows of perhaps asylum seekers, displaced individuals, recruitment of skilled labour, the other end of that, and ways in which they are attempting to try and incorporate those in those groups into some kind of notion of the national and so on. So I think we need to look beyond education also to areas like migration, changes in labour markets, movements of labour and those kinds of things to come up with a kind of fuller account.
Yeah, they appear on the surface to be contradictory, but I don't think they are. I think I'm persuaded to sort of follow your line of reasoning around what's going on here about how do these two forces actually reinforce, that seem contradictory, actually reinforce each other. Yeah, thank you.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on an organization such as the International Baccalaureate, which is trying to produce a global citizen, but really marketing an international curriculum for everyone.
Okay. So the International Baccalaureate is quite interesting because it is a global education. I mean, I could have probably put an example up of the IB, which actually has its own forms of private authority as well. And the international schools, many of whom use the International Baccalaureate, have, you know, you have to buy into, you know, being prepared to be properly audited, and you have to pay an amount of money and those kinds of things. And down in national spaces, for example in England, they've been toying with the International Baccalaureate and so on. So these are kind of, I mean, I think what that does is highlight the fact that that what we would understand as an education system, kind of state-run and so on, is increasingly joined by the growth of international schools. CFBT, for example, which is the Council for British Teachers, it has got its own schools in China, completely run by English teachers, English curriculum, English examinations and so on. So other actors with these expanding chains in many ways. International Baccalaureate is a credential, but the international schools are using it. They're an expanding kind of group, and particularly they operate in the China market. It makes me argue that in fact what's important is to see it as a sector. So I would want to, and have elsewhere argued for, what I call a sectoral analysis that would then include all these other bits. And someone like Julia Resnick would be doing similar kind of work as well. So what does this all look like? Not just the system that we kind of think is the one we know, but the other bits that are in there, and who goes where and why and what outcomes.
Please.
You talked about the shareholders and in relationship with some institution or organization like Bill and Melinda Gates. I want to introduce another concept as the stakeholders, and those people who are receiving those services or whatever from these institutions. And I want to know that you, as a policymaker, do you get your data from the stakeholders, that how they feel about these services, educational services they receive from that, and adjust your theories and criticism based on the information from the stakeholders? Or is it just in the level of the academic, like, okay, let's, it's a kind of simplified, but let's attack the, for example, the capitalism way, or like the Belinda and this, on academic level. So let's criticizing based on our own concepts, rather than getting the data from the local or people who are stakeholders there and receive those, and how they feel and about their experiences.
Okay, so I'm going to differentiate between shareholder and stakeholder. Okay, and in the case of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the foundation itself would actually be run by a governing board, and they would actually have to be accountable for the funds that are actually going into that foundation. Okay. Pearson would represent a shareholder-driven model. Okay, you've got, this is on the stock exchange, you've got, it's on the FTSE 100, and shareholders actually demand a return on the investments. Okay, so a good example for me would be where Apollo Global owns a for-profit university in the UK. And the shareholders all got rather twitchy that there wasn't enough money being returned from that investment. And clearly that investment, where's the money to come from? Well, it's coming from student fees and so on. So that's a shareholder-driven model. And the argument essentially, particularly around the financial crisis, has been it's the escalation of shareholder-driven capitalism that actually has generated the financial crisis. And in particular where the those who managed, for example, these CEOs, many of them had share issues, for example, so they were never in a position to kind of ask questions about things that were going on. If I go to the stakeholder question, I mean, the question you'd have to pose here is, if we come back to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that's a very big stake that they've got with that amount of money. And this is kind of, let's say you're a stakeholder, a parent, okay, who's got a child at one of these 6 states. Okay? The voice of the Gates Foundation and your voice are very different. And that's the simple point I'd want to make. We might say that in a democracy, we've got an equal opportunity as stakeholders to be heard. But some have got a huge stake in that, and that fundamentally is the issue in that. Now, I'm not actually wanting to say all foundations operate that way, and in fact elsewhere I've looked at the ways in which the foundations, for example Ford, Carnegie and so on, were very non-specific about the way the money would be spent in the education sector. You'd provide grants, but they were not directive. It would be, but increasingly this is very project driven. Okay? They've got a very clear commitment to value-added measures. Let's say you don't think that that's the way it should go in your school. Well, tough now. So it's nice to think that we've got, and I would want to argue for a stakeholder-driven model, but that's not what we're looking at when we're looking at that.
We can take 3 questions more, really, because I think otherwise we'll put some people into conflict here unfairly. So perhaps I'll stop for 30 seconds to allow people who need to evacuate because they have classes and other commitments. And then we can take the 3 questions and then bring this to a conclusion, because I know how bubbling is the terrain here for lots of more questions, but I think we are quite limited. So we'll go into that. So, Noreen, then Conrad, and then Hongxue.
I'm Noreen.
Okay.
My question is around the literacies you talked about, and particularly in the context of the developing world.
Yes.
Where you have governments wanting to partner, say, with some of these developing agencies, or with universities in this part of the world, and trying to balance that need for bringing in the money that the development agency would bring, or the expertise that the partner university would bring, with needs for social development and really curricula and education that is relevant to that region. And often they don't have either the financial capacity or the sort of bureaucratic infrastructure needed to regulate or understand the impact of taking in and working with large development agencies. What kind of literacies are you looking at? I mean, how does a government balance a government that is, majorly in a deficit mode? How do you balance that priority?
I mean, it's a hugely important question, and I would want to say that let's go back to this kind of notion that a community should have some kind of say about education. So right across in many parts of the world, we saw very significant decentralization. And the idea would be that you would have, a community would have some say in the management of their school and policy at that kind of level. But in many developing countries, the aid architectures changed fairly significantly. So you had sector-wide approaches that came in. Negotiations took place, let's say, between the World Bank and all the big donor agencies with the government. Typically, a community is not there. Okay, so it's happening up here. Okay, so then the question, I mean, it's even not just a question of what kind of literacy. You'd actually even just have to be able to be there in, let's say, Dar es Salaam at those meetings and be represented and that kind of thing. So in that sense, there's a huge kind of mismatch between how we know aid has been coming in through this sector-wide swaps and things like that, and actually what happened to schools and their communities and parents and that kind of thing. And there are better examples than others, I think, in places like Tanzania. The union and parental groups have been able to mobilise and have some conversations. But in places like Kenya, that hasn't actually happened. I was in a meeting last week where, in fact, everyone was just saying, well, let's have public-private partnerships. And what they think is the public-private partnership actually means that it's all straightforward. Okay? But a public-private partnership is a legal contract. The legal contract's being struck, largely written by lawyers who are operating in the interests of the big suppliers. Okay? What kind of literacy then would a government even need? Or a subnational unit need if it's coming into, let's say, a subnational education system, to actually ask questions about, risk and, let's say, if the population changed, how could you vary the contract? Well, you can't unless it's very significant amounts of money. So these are kind of serious, big issues that need to be addressed, really, and it's very difficult to think about how you would actually do that. But I've been involved in trying to run some summer schools around trying to generate a level of literacy where students come in who are kind of in policy and maybe activists like ActionAid into these spaces where we look at even tools, funding tools, and what questions would you need to ask and so on. The group called ASBAY that I talked about, they're actually developing a primer. So what questions should you be asking if you're a school or a government around these public-private partnerships is one example.
Thank you. Conrad?
A very enlightening talk. Thanks very much. At the end of this, my question is ultimately for some methodological advice. But to preface it, you mentioned Sasson a few times, and one of the critiques I often read about Sasson's perspective is that perhaps it overstates the locus of power moving up to a global level and understates how states are reappropriating power from a global level to use state power. Yeah. Things like competition state or the evaluative state. Yeah. Those types of concepts. And the type of work that I'm very interested in the UK and Canada, etc., where private actors are getting involved in education in a very forceful way or a very subterranean way, as the case may be. But I look a lot at Germany and France, where you don't see the recommodification of education. In fact, the experiments with Germany doing that, they've now decommodified, so they're not decommodified, so there's no tuition being charged in 14 of the Länder. And so you don't have that obvious recommodification. Yeah. You could argue the stratification is still there. However, so I guess the question is, if I was to do a critical policy analysis of those types of states where I can see quasi-market mechanisms but no markets, how would I recognize how would I be critical and how would I recognize that type of policy where it's a state that's reappropriating that kind of neoliberalism when there aren't private actors or many private actors getting involved?
I mean, your observation is correct. I mean, Dennis St. Martin writes a very interesting piece that would be worth you reading, because he looks at he does a kind of tripartite study on Canada, I think it's at perhaps Quebec, with the UK, England specifically, and France. And he actually looks at the extent to which the kind of private consultants and so on just never get any traction in France, for example. Sort of in the Canadian context, and absolutely in the case of, and it was the extent to which the state, the bureaucratic state, the apparatus of the state was very, very open to, you couldn't, for example, do any kind of education initiative unless you put it out to private consultants in England. Okay, that was the first step. Whereas in France, it was much more bureaucratic. The consultants couldn't get any traction, and in fact, you see quasi markets for sure, but you don't see the hollowing out of the state in terms of the privatised interests within the state. Okay, so I think being critical actually means, in this case, in the case both of France and Germany, is to actually not insist that we're to see neoliberalism there. It's to actually understand what the nature of the politics were that mediated a different set of outcomes. Okay, that's what I would be looking at. So it's to say, how did this come to be? And so I wouldn't be. I'm not looking for, neoliberalism as an over-determining project, although it's been incredibly powerful. But in what places has its project been, pushed back, and I think, or ameliorated in particular ways? And why was the state so open to business in particular places? Now, in the case of England, it would be many of the political elite are very good friends with the economic elite, and as a historic commitment to, liberalism and liberal capitalism and so on, markets, etc., it's been much more willing and open to pursue those kinds of initiatives. So you should see uneven development, really, because I would argue politics matters. And in the case of the French academics have organised themselves. I have a colleague who argues that, and she's frustrated, she says the teachers just get in the way, and she wants more change in school. She's a social welfare worker. But teachers have actually pushed professionalism and argued that, in fact, there's no place for these kinds of actors in their spaces.
Just to comment, the discourse seems to be about modernisation in the context of France, Germany, not neoliberalism, because that's such a dirty word in France, but it still amounts to the same type of deprofessionalisation of some professions.
Yes, it's interesting, new public management, as some of our colleagues have only just started to talk about. They say, Susan, new public management is here, and I'm thinking, heavens, I was kind of working on that in the 1980s. How is the France has managed to resist all this? And they've been out on the streets and demonstrating, and what will happen with Hollande, I don't know. But there's a bit of an argument that the more layers of government you have, the more you slow down the rate of change. But I think it depends on organised interests as well.
Thank you. Last question, Hong Xia.
Actually, my question was what the methodological implications of your theoretical work here. So it's really along the same line, especially in cases where, as he said, where really the states, for instance, in the case of China, the state appropriate neoliberal discourses for state or national purposes. So my question was, my question now is related to an earlier note that you made regarding a different toolset or toolkit that is needed when you study cases, study places where things are not exactly the same as in the West.
Yes, and I would probably say that, China would be, I have students working on China, and we are trying to work up kind of sets of resources. So, for example, even it's not possible to talk about social class in the same way. You can talk about, and to some extent Bourdieu is useful because you can talk about political capital. Membership of the party actually matters for what your education experiences end up being by virtue of which key schools you might go to and so on. But my argument, I think, would be that the toolkit needs to come out of the phenomena that you're looking at. In a way, that's where I started. It was to say, okay, Prunty develops a toolkit or a set of signposts, not a toolkit, a set of signposts that would guide a way of looking at the policy terrain in the 1980s and so on. And my argument, I hope I've made, is that terrain, politics in the world has changed. And so therefore the kind of signposts that we need also need to begin to change, that help us ask different kinds of questions. I think to go into the China and Greater China space, it would be to do the same kind of thing, to say, and Latin America I would argue the same, like what kinds of signposts make most sense for those spaces that we're trying to understand. What is the nature of those politics? What's their histories? And that we would actually develop a kind of a dialectical kind of conversation between the phenomena and the tools. So it's to try and get a closer link then between our tools and how we look at the world, and the different worlds we're looking at.
Thank you very much. I would like just to say my position is sitting in this part of the room to really appreciate, to say how much I appreciated this opportunity to come together with Susan and our department and even beyond of our department. So I really think we have engaged in a set of questions that I have not heard in this department raised collectively, at least at this intensity. And I think that many of the points that were raised today, I'm sure, will be fueling our discussions in this department and beyond for some time to come. The more so that in this or other way, we're almost all connected to the kinds of fundamental, foundational issues that your lecture raised. If I may add as well to that, my own perspective, I mean, a little bit on the issue of privatization, etc., in some work that has been sitting in press for the last 8 months, so I hope that it comes out at some point, but it is in press, I'm told. I think I agree with you about the tremendous kind of contribution that the work of Saskia Sassen has to unpack what we mean by privatization and the repositioning of whatever is called as public or whatever is called as private. And fundamental to her work, I think, is the whole concept of sovereignty. Mm. Mm. Sovereignty that you could interpret politically, yeah, within traditional political science, but sovereignty you could interpret as well as a cultural phenomenon, as for example in the work of Giorgio Agamben, the state of exception, glory and the state, etc., etc., etc. And also, I think, sovereignty in the sense of an economic work, an economic process like the one Aiwa Ong is talking about. And therefore, if I take these three dimensions, then we have a kind of cultural dimension, we have a kind of political dimension, and we have a kind of economic dimension. Adding to that Saskia Sassen's emphasis on territorial, spatial processes. And I think then one can realize the daunting task ahead of us, methodologically and conceptually, to bring these different dimensions to bear on the kind of analysis that we want to do. And particularly in terms of reconfiguring the notion of sovereignty and how it starts to infiltrate different spaces, different practices, different policies, in ways that actually recast not just the state, but even the legal and juridical status of foundations that almost become like semi-states or quasi-states of some kind. And I think that this dimension, these multifaceted processes, emphasize also the need to think carefully about an aspect that you started talking about around the issue that many of these phenomena are around the reconstruction and the refilling of established concepts with new meanings. And what I'm trying to say, that part of the challenges to understand privatization and the recasting of the public is because that at the same time that we are dealing with political processes, economic processes, and these were clearly outlined here, we are also dealing not just with a project to rule, but a cultural project, without which much of what is put out cannot really be made to be held together and have some efficiency, a political efficiency. And so looking at that, at these processes also as part of a larger cultural process, or a cultural enterprise, I would say, of some kind, is very important in terms of understanding really the long-standing effects of what we are seeing. And I think that here, to piggyback on what Conrad has asked and the case of France that you've introduced, I think shows the importance of this cultural dimension. Yeah. Particularly in Republican France over the backdrop of the last 200 years of its history. And the kinds of embedded, I would say, resistances that are built in ways that actually resonate with a Tocquevillian almost vision of things, of almost a continuity in change, or change in continuity. You can put it whatever you want. So just to say in that humble way, just thank you very much for challenging our minds in that direction. And thanks as well for manifesting this community so beautifully. And I hope that we would have much more opportunities as part of the cultural series, but also as part of the daily routines of our department. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Andre.
Thank you very much.